It was supposed to be a fun night out with friends. We'd been planning this Christmas gathering for weeks, and the excitement had finally reached a fever pitch. I arrived at Emily's house early, eager to get into the holiday spirit. The tree was already lit up, casting an eerie glow over the room. The sound of Bing Crosby crooning "White Christmas" wafted from the living room, making my skin crawl. As I handed out gifts and sipped on hot cocoa, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was off. It started with small things, a faint scratching noise in the walls, the flickering of the lights like they were being manipulated by an unseen hand. I brushed it off as mere paranoia, but deep down, I knew better. It wasn't until Emily received a mysterious package on her doorstep that the night took a dark turn. The box was unmarked and plain, but the label inside read "For Christmas" in childish scrawl. Inside, we found a small, ornate music box with a note attached: "Play me, and you'll never leave this place." I felt a chill run down my spine as Emily wound up the box, its melody unlike anything I'd ever heard before, haunting, discordant, and utterly unsettling. As the night wore on, more packages arrived. Some contained strange trinkets, while others held cryptic messages scrawled on plain paper. It was as if some unknown entity had taken an interest in our little gathering, watching us with an unblinking gaze. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, but it lingered, festering like a wound that wouldn't heal. As we sat around the tree, the scratching noise grew louder, and the lights began to strobe like a madman's laughter. I knew then that something was very wrong, but I had no idea what or where this night would lead us. As the hours ticked by, the atmosphere in the room grew more and more oppressive. The music box's haunting melody had become a constant companion, echoing through our minds like a mantra of dread. We tried to change the subject, but nothing seemed to lift the mood. Even Emily's usual cheeriness was muted, her eyes haunted by some unseen fear. It was then that Matt suggested we take a break and get some fresh air. I agreed, and we stepped outside into the chilly night air. The sky was a deep, foreboding gray, like a physical manifestation of our collective unease. The stars were hidden behind a veil of clouds, as if they too were afraid to shine in this forsaken place. As we stood there, frozen in silence, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A figure, tall, imposing, and featureless, stood at the edge of the porch, watching us with an unblinking gaze. It didn't move or speak. It simply stood there, a monument to malevolent presence. We tried to ignore it, but our eyes kept drifting back to the figure. It was as if we were drawn to it, helpless to resist its cold, calculating stare. I felt my heart racing in my chest, and Matt's hand found mine, his grip tight with fear. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure vanished. The porch was empty, the night air silent once more. We stood there, frozen in shock, waiting for something to happen, anything to break the spell that had been cast over us. But it didn't come. Instead, we were left with an eerie silence, punctuated only by the distant sound of carolers singing "Jingle Bells" in a voice that sent shivers down my spine. It was a sound I'd never heard before, yet somehow, it seemed to be familiar, like a warning from some long-forgotten nightmare. As we watched, the figures of the carolers grew larger, their faces twisted into grotesque grins. They moved closer, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly light until they were right at our doorstep. And then, in perfect synchrony, they began to sing. "All is calm, all is bright." As the carolers' haunting melody faded away, I felt an irresistible pull, as if the very fabric of reality was beckoning us to follow. It started with a subtle vibration in my feet, like the hum of a far-off engine. The sensation spread up my legs until I could feel it coursing through my veins like liquid darkness. Matt and Emily seemed entranced, their eyes glassy and unfocused as they gazed into the void. Without a word, we stepped forward, drawn by some unseen force into the heart of the darkness. The air seemed to thicken around us, taking on a life of its own. It grew colder, heavier, until I could feel it pressing against my skin like a physical weight. The sound of the carolers' song still echoed in my ears, but it was distant now, muffled by some unseen barrier. We moved forward, our feet carrying us across a vast expanse of nothingness. The ground beneath us seemed to be shifting, rippling like water. I stumbled, and Matt caught me by the elbow, his grip firm and reassuring. Emily walked ahead of us, her eyes fixed on some point in the distance. As we walked, the darkness began to coalesce around us. Shapes took form, twisting and writhing like living things. I saw hints of furniture, chairs, tables, even a Christmas tree, but they were all distorted, twisted into grotesque parodies of their former selves. The air was thick with the scent of decay and rot. And then we stumbled into a room. It was small, dimly lit, and filled with an eerie, pulsing glow. In the center of the room, a single chair sat waiting for us. It was adorned with strange symbols, etched into the wood in a language I couldn't understand. Matt and Emily moved towards it, their eyes fixed on some unseen horror. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. Something about that room felt wrong, like we were walking into a trap, but I couldn't turn back now. I took a deep breath and followed my friends into the unknown. We sat in the chair, our eyes adjusting to the dim light. The symbols etched into its surface seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, as if they were alive and watching us. Matt and Emily exchanged a nervous glance, but I just felt a growing sense of unease. Something was off about this place, something that went beyond mere decorum. Suddenly, the air was filled with the sound of distant singing. It was low and mournful, like the wail of a lost soul. The words were indistinguishable, but the melody was unmistakable. It was Silent Night, but not as I knew it. The song seemed to be coming from all around us, echoing off the walls in a way that made my skin crawl. And then the singing stopped. The silence was oppressive, heavy with anticipation. That's when we saw him. He was standing just beyond the edge of the room, his back to us. He was dressed in a long black coat with a red waistcoat underneath, and a top hat perched on his head. But it was his face that really caught my attention. It was twisted into a grotesque grin, revealing pointed teeth and sunken eyes. Matt and Emily gasped in unison, their eyes fixed on the figure like they were hypnotized. And then he turned to face us. His eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a jolt of electricity run through my body. "Welcome, children," he said in a voice that was both low and menacing. "I've been waiting for you." He moved closer, his eyes never leaving mine. "My name is the Caroler, and this is my home. You'll be staying here for a while." As he spoke, the room began to change around us. The walls seemed to shift and writhe like living things. The air grew colder until I could see my breath misting in front of me. And then everything went black. As I came to, I found myself lying on a narrow bed, the walls of the room seeming to close in around me. Matt and Emily were beside me, their eyes sunken and their skin pale. The caroler stood over us, his grin still plastered on his face. "You're all feeling better?" he asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. I tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness washed over me, forcing me back onto the bed. The caroler chuckled, his eyes glinting with amusement. "Don't worry, children," he said. "You'll be fine." As he spoke, the room began to grow darker, the shadows deepening and twisting into grotesque forms. I could feel eyes upon us, watching us from the darkness. Matt and Emily seemed to sense it too, their eyes darting nervously towards the shadows. Suddenly, a faint scratching sound filled the air like fingernails on wood. It was soft at first, but grew louder and more insistent. The caroler's grin faltered for a moment before he regained his composure. "That's just the little guests," he said, his voice low and menacing. "They're waiting for you." I tried to sit up again, but my body felt heavy, as if it was being held down by an invisible force. The scratching grew louder until it sounded like a chorus of tiny voices, all whispering my name. Matt and Emily were staring at me, their eyes wide with fear. "What's going on?" Matt whispered, but I couldn't answer. All I could do was lie there, trapped in a living nightmare from which I might never awaken. We were trapped in a world of madness, where the lines between reality and nightmare were blurred beyond recognition. The caroler's presence seemed to be the catalyst for it all, his sinister grin and twisted laughter echoing in our minds like a mantra of terror. At first, it was just small things. Matt would forget what he was saying, or Emily would stare at us with an unblinking gaze that made my skin crawl. But as the days passed, the madness deepened. We started to see things that weren't there, shadowy figures lurking in the corners of our minds, disembodied voices whispering cruel taunts in our ears. The caroler seemed to be enjoying our downfall, his grin growing wider and more twisted with every passing day. He'd appear at random intervals, his eyes glinting with malevolence as he spoke in a voice that was both familiar and yet utterly alien. "You're not going to escape," he'd say, his words dripping with malice. "You'll be trapped here forever, stuck in this never-ending nightmare." And then he'd laugh, the sound echoing through our minds like a cold wind on a winter's day. One by one, we started to unravel. Matt would lash out at us for no reason, his eyes wild with fury. Emily would stare blankly into space, her mind lost in a world of madness. And I'd just sit there, feeling like I was drowning in a sea of despair. The caroler's grip on our sanity was suffocating, crushing us beneath its weight. We were trapped in a living hell, with no escape from the horrors that surrounded us. We were trapped in a never-ending cycle of terror, reliving the same moments over and over again. The caroler's laughter echoed through our minds, his words dripping with malice as he taunted us with our own worst fears. Matt would scream at us to get away from him, only for him to turn around and smile sweetly. Emily would beg for help, but her eyes would glaze over and she'd forget who we were. And I'd be left alone, trapped in a world of madness that seemed to have no end. The clock on the wall ticked at a maddening pace, each passing moment feeling like an eternity. We were stuck in this loop, reliving the same horrors over and over again. And yet, every time it happened, I swore I saw something different. A glimpse of a door that wasn't there before, a shadowy figure lurking just out of sight. It was as if the very fabric of reality was shifting around us, making it impossible to distinguish what was real from what was just a product of our own fevered imaginations. The caroler's laughter grew louder and more intense, his words becoming a cacophony of terror that threatened to consume us all. And then, suddenly, everything went black. When I came to, we were back where we started, standing in the same room with the same eerie glow emanating from the Christmas tree. The caroler was nowhere to be seen, but I knew he was still there, waiting for us to make the same terrible mistake all over again. And so the loop continued, a never-ending cycle of horror and despair that seemed to have no end. As the loop continued, I began to lose track of time. Days turned into weeks and weeks turned into months, But no matter how much time passed, we remained stuck in this never-ending cycle. The carolers' laughter was always there, echoing through our minds like a mantra of terror. But one day, something changed. As we stood in the same room, staring at the Christmas tree with its glowing eyes, I realized that time had stopped. Not just for us, but for everyone else as well. The world outside was frozen in place, stuck in an eternal present. And yet within this timeless bubble, we were trapped in a perpetual loop. We relived the same moments over and over again, with no escape from the horrors that surrounded us. But it was different now. I could see things that I had never noticed before. The intricate patterns on the walls, the way the shadows danced across the floor. It was as if time itself had been stripped away, leaving only the present moment to endure. And in this eternal present, I saw something that gave me hope. A glimmer of light just beyond the edge of our reality. It was a doorway hidden from us by the carolers' magic. But it was there, waiting for us to find it. With newfound determination, we set out to explore this doorway, to escape the loop and break free from the carolers' grasp. For in that eternal present, I knew that time itself was our only hope. We followed the light through a winding corridor, our hearts pounding with excitement and fear. The air was thick with the scent of old toys and dust. Every step revealed a new terror, a new toy that seemed to come to life before our eyes. A rocking horse that sang a haunting melody, its wooden face twisted into a scream. A teddy bear that clutched a bloody paw, its glassy eyes staring at us with malevolence. A music box that played a nursery rhyme but with lyrics that spoke of death and despair. The toys seemed to be watching us, their gaze following us as we moved through the corridors. We quickened our pace, our footsteps echoing off the walls. But no matter how fast we ran, the toys kept pace with us, their presence growing more oppressive with every step. And then we saw it. A room filled with toys, each one more terrifying than the last. There was a giant doll that loomed over us, its face a twisted grin. A ball pit of razor-sharp plastic balls that seemed to move of their own accord. A playpen filled with crawling, writhing creatures that looked like something from a nightmare. The toys surrounded us, closing in on all sides. We were trapped, with no escape from the horrors that surrounded us. And then the caroler spoke, his voice booming through the room. "Welcome to my collection," he said, his eyes glinting with malevolence. "You'll never leave." The toys closed in, their cold, dead eyes fixed on us as we realized that we were doomed to spend eternity trapped in this twisted playroom. The room was a blur of color and chaos as the toys closed in. We tried to run, but our legs were like lead weights, refusing to move. The doll's grin seemed to grow wider as it reached out to us, its arms like skeletal fingers. Matt let out a blood-curdling scream as he was grabbed by one of the crawling creatures from the playpen. Emily stumbled backwards, her eyes wide with terror, as she tripped over a ball pit of plastic balls. And I was left standing alone, frozen in fear as the toys seemed to close in on me from all sides. The caroler's laughter echoed through my mind, his words dripping with malice as he whispered, "You'll never escape." Suddenly, everything went black. When I came to, I was lying on the floor, my head throbbing with pain. Matt and Emily were nowhere to be seen. But as I struggled to sit up, I saw that our bodies were twisted and broken, like putty that had been stretched to its limits. We were no longer whole, no longer intact. The toys seemed to be laughing at us now, their cold, dead eyes fixed on us with a malevolent glee. And then I remembered the light we had seen earlier, the doorway that led out of this twisted playroom. With a surge of adrenaline, I stumbled to my feet and staggered towards it. But as I reached out to grab the door handle, I felt a cold hand wrap around my ankle, pulling me back down to the floor. The toys were closing in once more, their laughter echoing through my mind like a mantra of terror. And then, everything went black again. We were dragged back to the twisted playroom, forced to join a festive feast of fears. The toys gathered around us, their cold eyes gleaming with malevolence as they presented us with a table groaning under the weight of our deepest terrors. A plate piled high with spiders and snakes, each one writhing and twisting like a living thing. A bowl of eyes that stared back at us, empty and dead, yet full of a hunger that made my skin crawl. And a cake that seemed to shift and writhe on the table, its frosting melting into a grotesque parody of our own faces. The caroler sat at the head of the table, his grin twisted and cruel as he raised his glass in a toast. "To our guests," he said, his voice dripping with malice, "may your fears be their feast." We were forced to eat and drink from this ghastly spread, each bite and sip plunging us deeper into a world of terror. The toys laughed and capered around us, their presence growing more oppressive with every passing moment. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, the music started. A discordant melody that seemed to shred my very soul. The toys began to dance, their movements jerky and unnatural as they twirled and leaped across the room. And we were forced to join them, our feet moving in time with the music as if we had no control over our own bodies. It was a nightmare from which I couldn't wake up, a never-ending feast of fears that would consume us all. As we danced through the twisted playroom, I felt my mind begin to unravel. The music was a cacophony of terror, the notes piercing my brain like shards of glass. The toys were everywhere, their faces twisted into cruel grins as they closed in on us from all sides. Matt and Emily were no longer there, consumed by some dark force that had taken them from me forever. I was alone, left to face the caroler's wrath in a desperate bid for survival. The music reached a crescendo, the notes swirling around me like a vortex of madness. And then, in an instant, everything went still. The music stopped, the toys froze in place, and the room fell silent. The caroler stood before me, his eyes blazing with a fierce and ancient power. "It's time for your final dance," he said, his voice low and menacing. "The dance of the damned." And with that, he reached out and took my hand. We moved across the room, our feet tapping out a slow and mournful rhythm on the cold floor. The toys watched us, their eyes fixed on me with an unblinking gaze. And as we danced, I felt my soul being torn apart, thread by thread. I was being pulled towards some dark and ancient power, some force that had been waiting for me all along. The final requiem of the damned began to play, a melody of sorrow and despair that echoed through eternity. And I knew that I would never be free.